The building was huge and gray, standing like a giant against the sky. And inside, it felt even bigger, with high ceilings that made whispers sound like shouts, and floors so shiny you could see your face in them. This was the Royal Conservatory of Music, a place where the best students from all over the country came to learn. And today was the most important day of the year. It was audition day, and the air in the waiting hall was thick with tension and the smell of expensive coffee mixed with the sharp scent of nerves. All around the room, students were sitting on velvet chairs, standing by the windows, or pacing back and forth. They looked perfect in their own way. The boys had their hair slicked back and wore crisp suits that probably cost more than some people make in a month. And the girls were in elegant dresses with their hair done up neatly, holding leather folders that contained their life's work. They looked like they belonged there, as if they were born with a silver spoon in one hand and a violin bow in the other. They spoke in low voices about their private teachers and the grand pianos they had at home. And it was clear that music was not just a hobby for them, it was a lifestyle that their parents had paid a lot of money to secure. Standing in the corner of the room, near a large potted plant, was a young woman who looked nothing like the others. She was not wearing a suit or an expensive dress. Instead, she wore a simple gray skirt and a white blouse that looked like it had been ironed many times to get the wrinkles out. Her shoes were old black leather that had seen better days and were polished not with expensive shoe polish, but with a lot of elbow grease. She did not carry a fancy leather folder. Instead, she held her music sheets in a simple plastic folder that was starting to crack at the edges, and her hands were rough, showing that she was used to working hard, not just playing piano. She had traveled for hours to get here, taking 2 different buses, because she could not afford a taxi or a car ride, and the journey had left her feeling tired and a bit messy, while the other students looked fresh and rested. She looked like she had been through a battle, but she stood tall with her back straight against the wall, watching everyone with quiet eyes. She did not try to talk to anyone, and no one tried to talk to her. It was as if there was an invisible wall separating her from the rest of the room. They were the elite, and she was just a visitor who had wandered in by accident. The conversations around her floated through the air, and she could not help but listen to them. A tall boy with perfect teeth was talking about his summer in Vienna, studying under a famous maestro, and a girl with diamonds in her ears was laughing about how hard it was to find a good piano tuner for her house. They spoke of music as something that came easy to them, as if they never had to struggle with a difficult note or a sore finger. But for the young woman in the corner, music had never been easy. It was something she had fought for every single day. She remembered the old beat-up piano in her neighbor's basement where she used to sneak in after school to practice, because she did not have one at home. She remembered the cold nights and the sore fingers, but she also remembered the feeling of hitting the right chord and how it made everything else disappear. The waiting room was starting to feel smaller, and the noise was getting louder as more students arrived, and the pressure in the room was rising. Everyone looked confident on the outside, but if you looked closely, you could see the fear in their eyes. They were all afraid of not being good enough, afraid of wasting their parents' money, afraid of the judges who were sitting behind a heavy door just down the hall. Everyone knew the reputation of these judges. They were famous for being cruel and for having ears that could hear the slightest mistake. They were known to reject students for having the wrong posture or the wrong type of shoes, or just for not having the right last name. And the thought of facing them made the young woman's heart beat a little faster. She looked down at her worn shoes and took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm in her chest. She knew that she did not have the background that the other students had. She did not have the expensive lessons or the fancy clothes, but she had something else. She had a hunger to play that burned inside her like a fire. She had spent every spare moment of the last 10 years learning everything she could about music. She had listened to old records until they were out. She had borrowed books from the library to learn music theory, and she had practiced until her hands bled. She was here because she loved music more than anything in the world, and she was going to give this audition everything she had, no matter what anyone else thought. Suddenly, the heavy door at the end of the room opened and a stern-looking woman with glasses stepped out. She held a clipboard in her hand and looked around the room with eyes that seemed to see right through everyone. The noise in the room stopped instantly, and everyone stood up a little straighter. The woman called out a name, but it was not the young woman's name. It was the name of the boy with the perfect teeth and the slicked back hair. He smiled confidently at his friends and walked towards the door, adjusting his suit jacket as he walked. He looked like he was walking to his victory, not to a test. The door closed behind him, and the room let out a collective breath that they did not know they were holding. Time moved slowly in the waiting room. Every minute felt like an hour, and the young woman could feel the sweat on her palms. She wiped them on her skirt, trying to dry them off. She looked at the door and imagined what was on the other side. She imagined the big stage with the spotlight shining down and the grand piano sitting in the middle, like a waiting beast. She thought about the judges sitting in the dark with their pens and their papers, ready to judge her, ready to laugh at her. Probably she knew what they would see when she walked in. They would see her old clothes and her messy hair, and they would think she was a joke. They would underestimate her before she even touched a key. It had happened before in smaller competitions and in school performances. People often looked at her and decided she was not worth listening to. They assumed that because she did not have money, she did not have talent. And it hurt every time. But she had learned to use that hurt. She had learned to let it fuel her playing. She wanted to show them that music does not care about money or clothes or who your parents are. Music only cares about the soul. And she had a soul that was bursting with songs that needed to be heard. Outside the window, the sky started to darken and clouds gathered, blocking out the sun, making the room feel even gloomier. But the young woman did not notice the change in light. She was too focused on the door and the sound of the piano drifting through the wood. Whenever the student inside played a loud passage, the people in the waiting room would crane their necks trying to listen, trying to figure out if the person playing was good or bad, trying to compare themselves to the competition. But the young woman just closed her eyes and listened to the rhythm in her own head. The boy with the perfect teeth came out of the room, looking a little pale now. His confidence seemed to have faded. He did not look at anyone as he walked back to his seat and sat down heavily, which made the others worry even more. The stern woman with the clipboard came out again and looked at her list. This time, she looked up and scanned the room until her eyes landed on the corner where the young woman was standing. The room went quiet again, and everyone turned to look at her, wondering who she was and why she was being called. Next, the woman called her name, and the sound of it in that fancy room felt strange, like it did not belong there. The young woman took a deep breath and pushed herself off the wall. She felt heavy legs moving, but she forced them to walk towards the door. She could feel the eyes of the other students burning into her back. She could feel the judgment and the confusion radiating off them. They were wondering why a girl like her was going into the audition room before them. They were probably thinking that the woman had made a mistake, or that this was some kind of prank. As she walked across the room, the whispers started soft at first, but getting louder. They were not loud enough to hear exactly what was being said, but she could feel the tone of it. It was mocking and cruel. Some of the students were even smiling at each other, sharing a joke at her expense. They saw her old clothes and her nervous walk, and they laughed. They did not see the years of practice, or the deep love of music. They only saw what was on the surface, and what they saw was something funny. She reached the door and paused for a second with her hand on the handle. She could hear the low murmur of laughter behind her, and it stung sharp, like a paper cut. But she did not turn around. She knew that if she turned around she would see their faces, and she might lose her courage. So she looked forward instead at the dark wood of the door, and she took one more deep breath, filling her lungs with air and filling her mind with the music she was about to play. She pushed the handle down and stepped across the threshold, leaving the whispers and the laughter behind her and stepping into the quiet unknown of the audition hall. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, cutting off the sounds of the waiting room. Instantly, the laughter and the whispers were gone, replaced by a silence so deep it felt heavy, like a thick blanket had been thrown over the entire world. The room was much larger than she expected. It felt like a giant hall with a ceiling that disappeared into the shadows above her. The air was cool and smelled of old wood and dust. The only light came from a large spotlight that shone down on the grand piano, sitting in the middle of the stage, making the instrument glow like a holy object while the rest of the room stayed dark. She stood there for a moment near the door, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light. She could see a long table set up about 10 feet away from the piano, and behind it sat 3 shadowy figures, the judges. They were silhouetted against the window, but she could feel their eyes on her, sharp and assessing. They were watching her every move, scanning her from her old shoes to her messy hair with a look that was far from welcoming. In the center sat an older man with gray hair and glasses. He held an expensive pen in his hand, and he was tapping it lightly on the table, looking incredibly bored, as if he had seen too many students that day. To his right was a woman with a sharp face, and her hair pulled back very tight into a bun. She looked stiff and cold, and she did not bother to hide her expression of disgust as she looked at the young woman's simple, worn clothes. On the left was another man who was younger, but looked just as arrogant. He leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed over his chest, staring at her as if she were an insect that had accidentally flown into the room. The older man in the middle looked down at his paper, and then back up at her. He did not smile, and he did not offer any encouragement. He just cleared his throat loudly, and the sound echoed through the hall, making the young woman jump slightly. He did not ask her name, because he already had it written on his paper in front of him, and he did not seem to care who she was anyway. He just wanted to get this over with. He gestured vaguely towards the piano with a wave of his hand, a dismissive movement that said, "Hurry up and play." The young woman took a step forward, but her legs felt like lead weights. They were heavy and hard to move. She felt completely exposed under the bright light and the intense gaze of the 3 people who held her future in their hands. She walked slowly towards the piano, her footsteps soft on the carpeted stage. As she got closer, she could hear the rustle of paper and a quiet whispering between the judges. They were not trying to be quiet enough. They either thought she was too far away to hear, or maybe they just did not care if she heard them. She reached the piano bench and paused to wipe her sweaty hands on her skirt again, trying to dry them so they would not slip on the keys. That was when she heard it. A low chuckle from the judge on the left. He leaned over to the woman next to him and whispered something that she could not hear clearly, but she saw the woman smirk and nod her head. Then the older man in the middle joined in with a dry, humorless laugh. It was not a happy laugh. It was a cruel laugh. The kind of laugh that people make when they think they are better than someone else. The laugh seemed to bounce off the walls and hit her in the chest. They were making fun of her. She knew it without being able to hear the exact words. They were laughing at her appearance, at her old clothes, at the way she walked. They were laughing at the idea that someone like her thought she could play in a place like this. It felt like a slap in the face. Hot and stinging. Her face flushed red with embarrassment, and she had to fight the urge to run back out the door and never come back. She wanted to scream at them that they were wrong, but she knew that would only prove them right. They would call her emotional and unstable and unprofessional. Instead of running, she took a deep, shaky breath and pulled out the piano bench. It made a loud screeching sound against the floor, which made the judges stop laughing for a second and look at her with even more annoyance. She sat down on the bench, and it felt cold and hard under her legs. The piano in front of her was huge and black and shiny. It was a beautiful instrument, worth more money than she could ever imagine. And for a second, she felt scared to touch it. What if she ruined it? What if her clumsy hands were not good enough for this masterpiece? She looked down at the keys, white and black in perfect rows, waiting for her. They looked like teeth ready to bite her if she made a mistake. She adjusted the distance of the bench, moving it forward a few inches and then backward, trying to find the right spot. The judges sighed loudly in unison. The man in the middle checked his watch and tapped his foot on the floor, clearly impatient. They were waiting for her to fail. They wanted her to play a few wrong notes so they could tell her to leave, and they could go back to their comfortable lives. The young woman closed her eyes for a moment, blocking out the judges and the room. And the fear in her mind. She took herself back to that small, damp basement room where she first learned to love music. She remembered the feeling of the old sticky keys under her fingers. And she remembered the music that played in her head when she closed her eyes. She could hear the melody, clear and strong. It was a song that she knew by heart. A song that she had played 1,000 times in the dark when no one was listening. She was not in this grand hall anymore. She was in her own world. A world where only the music mattered, and where no one could judge her based on what she was wearing or how much money her parents had. She sat up straighter and her shoulders dropped, the tension leaving her body slowly. She was ready. She slowly lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys. The ivory felt cool and smooth under her fingertips. The silence in the room grew even heavier as the judges watched, waiting for her to fail, waiting for her to play a wrong note so they could send her away and laugh about her over dinner later. But the young woman did not move her hands yet. She just sat there, feeling the vibration of the instrument, connecting with it in a way that only a true musician can understand. She took one last deep breath and opened her eyes. The fear was still there in the pit of her stomach, but it was smaller now, hidden behind a wall of pure determination. She looked at the keys, not as a test to pass, but as a friend to talk to. She was ready to show them what she could do. She was ready to make them listen. The silence in the room grew louder with every passing second. It was not a peaceful silence, but a heavy and suffocating one that pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight. The young woman sat on the bench without moving a muscle while her hands rested lightly on the cold keys of the grand piano. The judges watched her with growing impatience, and the man in the middle tapped his pen against the wooden table, creating a rhythmic and annoying clicking sound that echoed through the hall. To him, this was clearly a waste of time. He had seen hundreds of students, and he knew within seconds that this girl did not belong here. Her clothes were wrong, her demeanor was wrong, and her silence was just annoying. He leaned back in his chair and exchanged a look with the woman on his right, who rolled her eyes so far back that only the whites were visible. They were communicating without words, a silent language of arrogance and superiority that said, "Get her out of here." They were ready to dismiss her before she even played a single note. They wanted her to stand up and walk away, so they could move on to the next student, the one who would play a safe and boring piece that would put them to sleep. But the young woman did not move. She kept her head bowed slightly, looking at her hands on the keys. They were rough hands, with calloused fingertips and short nails, trimmed for practicality, not beauty. These were the hands of a worker, not a concert pianist, at least. That was what the judges saw. But she knew differently. She knew the strength that lived in those fingers. She knew the hours of repetition that had built up the muscles in her hands and the memory in her mind. Inside her head, a storm was raging. Voices were shouting at her to leave, telling her that she was a fool for thinking she could compete here. The laughter from moments ago was still ringing in her ears, sharp and mocking. It told her that she was dirty and poor and unworthy of this beautiful room. She felt a hot flush of shame rise up her neck, and her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird desperate to escape. Part of her just wanted to run away, to flee the judgment and the cruelty, and go back to her small world, where at least she knew her place. It would be so easy to just stand up and apologize for wasting their time, and then walk out that heavy door and disappear forever. But then she looked at the keys again, and she remembered why she was here. She remembered the sound of the rain on the roof of the old house where she grew up, and the way the music would block out the sound of her parents arguing late at night. She remembered the feeling of the old broken piano in the church basement where the keys stuck and the pedals squeaked. But the sound was pure and true, because it came from the heart. Music had been her escape and her savior when she had nothing else. It was the one thing in her life that had never asked for money or status. It only asked for honesty and emotion, and that was what she was going to give them. Slowly, she began to breathe in and out in a steady rhythm, ignoring the judge with the tapping pen and ignoring the woman with the cold eyes. She shut out the world around her until it was just her and the instrument in front of her. The tension in her shoulders began to melt away, dripping down her spine and disappearing into the floor. She sat up straighter and her spine became strong and rigid like a tree, rooted in the earth. Her expression changed from one of fear to one of intense focus. Her eyes narrowed slightly and her jaw set in a hard line. The fear was still there, hiding in the dark corners of her mind, but it was small now, and it was under her control. She was no longer the scared girl in the waiting room. She was a musician about to speak. The judges sensed the shift in the air. The tapping of the pen stopped, and the man leaned forward slightly, frowning. He was confused by her sudden change in posture. The girl, who had looked like she was about to cry a moment ago, now looked like a statue made of stone, unmovable and powerful. The woman stopped, rolling her eyes, and watched with a curious and wary expression. They could feel a strange energy coming from her, something they had not expected. It was a quiet power that seemed to fill the empty spaces of the hall. The young woman took one last deep breath and filled her lungs with the cool air of the room. She closed her eyes for a brief second to clear her mind of all the noise. And then she opened them again, looking straight ahead at the music stand, but seeing something else entirely. She was not looking at notes on a page. She was looking into herself, pulling up the melody that had lived inside her for so long. Her hands hovered over the keys for a fraction of a second, testing the distance and feeling the magnetic pull of the strings inside the piano. The anticipation in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The judges were holding their breath without even realizing it. They were waiting for the failure they were expecting. A clumsy mistake, a sour note, a sign of weakness. But the young woman did not give them what they wanted. She was beyond caring about their approval or their money. She was here to play, and she was going to play like her life depended on it. Because, in a way, it did. The silence stretched for one more heartbeat, a single moment frozen in time, where anything was possible. And then she lowered her fingers to the keys, not tentatively, not shyly, but with a firm and decisive touch that signaled the end of her fear and the beginning of her story. The moment her fingers touched the keys, the sound that exploded from the piano was not what anyone expected. It was not a gentle or tentative testing of the waters, but a sudden and massive crash of sound, like a thunderclap rolling through an empty valley. The first chord was deep and resonant, and it seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. The sound waves hit the walls and bounced back, filling every corner of the vast hall with a vibration that you could feel in your chest as well as hear. It was a sound that demanded to be heard, a sound that was impossible to ignore. The judges, who had been leaning back in their chairs with looks of boredom on their faces, were instantly bolt upright. The man in the middle, who had been tapping his pen, stopped, his hand frozen in midair. As the sound washed over him, his eyes went wide and his mouth fell open just a fraction. The woman on the right, who had been so full of disdain just moments ago, dropped her clipboard onto the table with a loud clatter, her hand going to her chest, as if the sound had physically knocked the wind out of her. The laughter that had been in the air just seconds before was completely vaporized, replaced by a shock that was palpable. You could see it on their faces, the realization that they had made a terrible mistake. The young woman did not stop to look at them. She did not pause to see their reaction. She was already lost in the music. The moment her fingers struck the keys, she was transported to a different place. A place where nothing existed but the melody and the rhythm. Her hands moved across the keyboard with a speed and fluidity that was breathtaking to watch. She was not just playing notes. She was weaving a complex tapestry of sound that was both technically perfect and emotionally raw. It was a difficult piece, a piece that required strength and dexterity and a deep understanding of the music, but she played it as if it were as simple as breathing. Her left hand jumped down the lower register, laying down a foundation of rhythm that was steady and driving like a heartbeat, while her right hand flew over the high keys, playing intricate runs and trills that sparkled like light on water. The music was not polite or safe. It was wild and untamed, full of sharp angles and sudden twists and turns. It told a story of struggle and pain, but also of hope and triumph. And as she played, you could hear the echoes of her own life in the notes. The hard times she had endured, and the strength she had found to keep going. The judges sat there in stunned silence, unable to look away from the spectacle unfolding in front of them. They had heard thousands of pianists in their careers, students who had trained at the best schools in the world, who played with technical perfection, but who often lacked soul. This girl was different. She had a fire in her playing that they had rarely seen. She played with a passion that was almost frightening in its intensity. The man in the middle stared at her hands, watching them blur across the keys. He was trying to understand how someone who looked so small and frail could produce such a powerful sound. He saw the way her body moved with the music, swaying and dipping, as if she was conducting a storm. He saw the sweat on her forehead beginning to form, and the intense focus in her eyes that never blinked. He realized then that he had judged her based on her appearance and her clothes, and he had been completely wrong. The woman on the right had stopped smirking, and was now leaning forward on the table, her eyes glued to the young woman's face. She was no longer seeing a poor girl in old clothes. She was seeing a true artist, a musician who spoke a language that went far beyond words. She felt a strange sensation in her chest, a feeling of awe and perhaps a little bit of shame for her earlier cruelty. The music continued to build, growing louder and more complex. The young woman was playing with a ferocity that seemed to consume her. She was hitting the keys hard, driving the sound out of the piano, but she never lost control. She was master of the instrument, bending it to her will. The sound filled the room, swirling around the judges and surrounding them, until they felt like they were drowning in the music. It was a physical force pushing against them, demanding their attention and their respect. There were no mistakes, no hesitations, just an endless stream of beautiful and powerful sound that seemed to go on forever. The young woman was unaware of the audience. She was unaware of the fancy room or the judges or even who she was. At that moment, she was just a vessel for the music, and it was flowing through her like a mighty river. She played sections of the piece that were incredibly fast, her fingers moving so fast they were almost a blur, and then she would suddenly transition into a slow and haunting melody that was so sad it made the air in the room feel heavy with emotion. It was a roller coaster of sound, taking everyone who listened on a journey through darkness and light. The judges were completely captivated. They had forgotten about their schedules and their egos and their prejudices. They were just three people, listening to a miracle. The man on the left, who had been so arrogant earlier, had his arms uncrossed now, and was resting his elbows on the table, his chin in his hands, watching her with the expression of pure wonder. He had never heard anything like this in his life, and he knew that he might never hear anything like it again. The young woman could feel the energy in the room change. She could feel the shock and the respect emanating from the table behind her, but she did not let it distract her. She kept her eyes fixed on the keys or closed tight as she felt the music. She pushed herself harder, playing with the intensity that left her gasping for breath. She put everything she had into this performance, every ounce of her talent, every memory of every struggle, every dream she had ever chased. She poured it all into the piano, and the instrument sang back to her, amplifying her voice and sending it out into the world. The sound was so loud and so vibrant that it seemed to rattle the windows and the chandeliers above. But it was not chaotic noise. It was organized and powerful and beautiful. The young woman reached the climax of the piece, a series of massive chords that thundered through the hall like waves crashing on a rocky shore. She played them with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, a reserve of power she had been saving for this exact moment. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. Her hands moved to the high end of the keyboard for a final delicate run of notes that were soft and clear, like a single drop of water falling on a still pond. These last notes hung in the air, shimmering and fragile, before they too faded away into silence. The final chord was struck, and she held her hands on the keys, letting the vibration die out naturally until there was nothing left but the sound of her own breathing and the silence of the room. The last sound of the piano faded away into the high ceiling of the hall, but the feeling of the music hung in the air like a heavy cloud. It was a silence that was completely different from the one before. This silence was not empty or bored. It was thick and charged with electricity. It felt like the air after a lightning strike, when the whole world holds its breath, waiting to see what happens next. The judges sat frozen in their seats. None of them moved a muscle. The man in the middle, who had been so dismissive and arrogant earlier, was now staring at the young woman with his mouth slightly open. His expensive pen had slipped from his fingers and rolled onto the floor, but he did not even notice. He just looked at her as if he was seeing a ghost or something impossible. The woman on the right had covered her mouth with her hand, and her eyes were wide and glistening with tears that threatened to spill over. She looked shocked, not just at the music, but at herself for judging this girl so harshly. The man on the left had stopped leaning back in his chair and was now sitting on the edge of his seat, his arms resting on the table, as he looked at the stage with the expression of pure wonder. The silence stretched on for a long time. The young woman sat on the bench with her hands resting in her lap. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling with the effort of the performance. Her fingers were trembling slightly from the adrenaline that was still rushing through her veins. She did not turn around to face the judges because she was terrified of what she might see. She still heard the laughter in her head from when she walked in, and she was afraid that if she turned around they would be laughing again, or worse, looking at her with pity. She felt small and exposed, sitting alone in the spotlight while the shadows of the judges loomed behind her. But then she heard a sound, the distinct sound of a chair scraping against the wooden floor. Her heart skipped a beat. She squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the rejection. She expected them to tell her to leave or to mock her playing, but instead she heard the sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, walking towards the front of the table. Then she heard the sound of hands clapping. It was a slow, rhythmic clap at first, just one person clapping in the massive room, but the sound was sharp and clear. It was the head judge. He was clapping not out of politeness, but with a deep respect that resonated through the hall. The young woman opened her eyes and slowly turned around on the bench to see the man standing there clapping. His face was serious, but his eyes were warm and filled with emotion. He was looking at her, not as a poor girl in old clothes, but as a true musician, a peer. The other two judges quickly followed his lead. They stood up and began to clap as well. The woman on the right was wiping tears from her cheeks as she applauded, and the man on the left was smiling, a genuine smile that broke his arrogant demeanor. The applause grew louder, filling the room with a roar of approval that was the complete opposite of the laughter from before. It was a sound of victory and validation. The young woman sat there stunned. For a moment, unable to comprehend what was happening. She had expected to be kicked out, and instead she was receiving a standing ovation from the toughest critics in the country. The head judge stopped clapping and held up his hand to quiet the room. The applause died down, but the energy remained high. He looked at the young woman and spoke in a voice that was loud and clear. He told her that in all his years of teaching, he had never heard a performance with so much soul and passion. He admitted that they had made a terrible mistake by judging her on her appearance and not on her talent. He said that her playing had silenced the room and touched their hearts in a way that technique alone could never achieve. He welcomed her to the conservatory and said that she belonged there more than anyone. The other judges nodded in agreement, and the woman even bowed her head slightly in apology for her earlier behavior. The young woman felt a lump form in her throat and tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, fighting against every obstacle and every person who told her she was not good enough. And now she had finally proved them wrong. She stood up slowly on shaky legs and bowed to them, not just because they were judges, but because they had listened and they had understood. She gathered her music sheets and placed them back into her simple, cracked folder. Feeling a new sense of pride in that old folder, she turned and walked towards the exit door with her head held high. She did not walk with her head down anymore. She walked with the confidence of someone who knows their own worth. When she opened the door and stepped back into the waiting hall, the noise of the students talking hit her again, but this time, it did not intimidate her. The room fell silent as she walked in. Everyone turned to look at her, wondering why she had taken so long and what had happened. In the audition room, they saw the look on her face and They saw the judges standing in the doorway, giving her a final nod of respect as she left. Some of the students looked jealous, others looked confused, and some just looked amazed. The rumor started immediately about who she was and where she came from, but she did not care. She walked through the crowd of wealthy students in their expensive clothes, and she felt like she was wearing a crown made of gold. She walked out of the building and into the cool evening air. The sun was setting over the city, casting a warm orange glow on the streets. She took a deep breath and smiled to herself. She knew that the road ahead would still be difficult. She would have to work hard to catch up on the theory she never learned in a classroom, and she would still have to deal with people who underestimated her. But she also knew that she had the strength to face it all. She had a gift that no one could take away from her, and she had finally found a place where she could use it. She walked towards the bus stop, her heart feeling light and free, ready for the next chapter of her life, knowing that she would never let anyone silence her music ever again.